Well, according to the book of Exodus, Moses was out tending to the flock of his father-in-law Jethro when off in the distance he saw a bush that was burning. It was burning, but it wasn't being consumed, which is very unusual, so he knew that something special must be happening. So he went to explore and examine what this could mean and what it could be. And as he got closer to the bush, the voice of God through an angel of the Lord spoke to Moses and said, Moses, don't come any closer. First you need to take off your shoes because you are standing on holy ground. So Moses takes off his shoes and he approaches the bush. And as he does so, God lays out this plan that God has for God's people. And God says to Moses, I've heard the cries of my people Israel. They're suffering a bondage of slavery in Egypt, and I am going to free them from slavery and deliver them to a promised land that is going to be filled with milk and honey, and it's going to allow them to live freely and worship freely and to live the abundant life that I have in store for them. And Moses thought that sounded like really good news. But then God said, you're going to be the one to make it happen. You're going to go. And you're going to confront Pharaoh, and you're going to convince the people of Israel that my message is true, and you're going to lead them across the wilderness to this land. You're going to be the guy. And Moses said, who, me? Who am I to go and do that? I'm not sure that I'm the right guy to go and do that. And then God reassured him a little bit, and then Moses said, well, really, I'm not really an expert. I'm not a delivery expert. I'm a shepherd. I don't really know how to do this. I don't think I've got the skills and the equipment. I just don't know enough to do this. God reassured him a little bit about that, and then Moses said, and they're not going to believe me. Then what am I going to do if they don't believe me? What if Pharaoh doesn't believe me? What if the people don't believe me? Then what's going to happen? No one's going to believe me. And God reassures Moses a little bit and says, no, that's not what's going to happen. And shows him some tricks and some things that Moses is going to be able to do, some miracles Moses is going to be able to perform to convince them. And then Moses says, though, God, I do have this speech issue. And we know that Moses had some kind of speech issue. We don't know what it was, but we know that he did. And he says to God, I can't go and do this because I've got to convince all these people to do this. I don't even talk well. I cannot do this. And God says, no, it's not a problem. Aaron's going to go with you, and Aaron will be the mouthpiece for you, and we'll do all that stuff. And so God reassures him with every reason, with every excuse that Moses offers. God offers a reason why that can be overcome, and that Moses is still the guy. So finally, after all of this give and take, Moses decides he's just going to shoot straight with God and be honest. And Moses says to God, I just wish you'd send someone else. I don't want to do it. Now, we don't know exactly why Moses was so hesitant. I'm sure we could all guess why Moses might have been hesitant. I do think that at least in some part, Moses was hesitant to answer the call of God because Moses was afraid. And we don't know, again, what all those fears might have been. But when you look at the kinds of questions he was asking, who am I? I'm not qualified. I don't know enough. I'm afraid I'm unbelievable. People will not believe me. And I'm not a very good public speaker, and I've got to go out and speak. I think, at least to some degree, Moses was expressing fear of failure. He was afraid that if he said yes, he didn't have the skills necessary to be successful. I think, at least in part, he was a little bit afraid of failure. Being afraid of failure is one of the most common fears that we carry as human beings. And one of the things that makes this fear so common and such a big deal for us is that being human means that you are going to fail. Every single one of us at some point, and for some of us multiple times throughout our life, we are going to fail. To be human means to fail. I like the way J.K. Rowling, the author of the Harry Potter series, says it. She says, it is impossible to live without failing at something unless you live so cautiously that you might as well not have lived at all. In which case, you fail by default. Right? That is true. I mean, that is very well put, and it's very well said. And there are times in our lives where we've got to decide, am I going to push through my failure, my fear of failure, or am I going to go ahead and pull back and recognize that maybe this fear of failure is speaking to me in a way that I need to listen to? And it doesn't matter whether it's answering the call of God, whether it's thinking about starting a family or ending a relationship, maybe starting a new career, going to a new school. It doesn't matter whether it's large or small. There come moments in our lives where we are confronted with the idea that if we don't do this right, we may fail, and sometimes that creates fear. The question is that fear rational or is it irrational? And how do we sort that out? Because if we're going to live lives that are unafraid, with courage and hope, even in the midst of uncertainty, we've got to figure out how to deal with our fear of failure so that we know when it's something we should listen to and we know when it's something that we should push through. Now, failing isn't always a bad thing. In fact, failing and not being successful can be a really good thing. When I look back on my life, and I have failed plenty of times, I've failed countless times, some of the best and most important lessons I've ever learned in my life came through failure. I think there are lessons to be learned through success, but there's a lot of lessons to be learned through failure. And one of the reasons that I'm such a big advocate of extracurricular activities for young people as they're going through school is it gives them the opportunity to experience failure. I don't care what program or activity a young person's involved in. I don't care if it's band or choir or drama or dance or scouting or sports, whatever, journal. I don't care what it is. I just think that every young person should be engaged in some kind of activity, in part so he or she can experience failure. Because as a young person, when you experience failure, you learn the skills required to both move past failure. We talk a lot about turning the page when I'm coaching. We're going to turn the page. We're all going to make mistakes. We're going to turn the page, and we're going to move on because we all make mistakes. But how are you going to respond to that? How are you going to respond to the mistakes and overcome them and go? And then what are you going to learn from it? Because sometimes we make a mistake and we say, why was I unsuccessful at that? Why did I fail at that? Well, maybe I didn't practice hard enough. Maybe I didn't prepare well enough. Maybe I got a little bit out ahead of myself and I wasn't quite ready for this. All of those activities really help a young person begin to deal with failure and subsequently the fear of failure. And I think it's a great time for them to learn it, because I would much rather a young person learn about failure as a 14-year-old on a baseball field than as an adult trying to navigate the waters of marriage and career and life and all of those kinds of things. And so I'm a big advocate of that. One of the other things that I recognize from my own growing up as I was engaged in sports is that I began to idolize people who were successful, and I would look up to them as a model of success. And one of the people that I looked up to when I was growing up was Michael Jordan. I just thought Michael Jordan was just about the greatest thing ever. And according to many, he was the greatest basketball player ever. He was so popular and so successful that he convinced millions of young boys to buy the ugliest shoes. You know which ones I'm talking about, right? You know which ones I had a pair of those. And I loved them, and I'm pretty convinced they made me a better basketball player. I loved my Air Jordans. And I looked to Michael Jordan as someone that I wanted to be like and someone that I wanted to play like. And yet, in the mid-1980s, Michael Jordan came out with a commercial that was, in essence, to sell his brand. And I want you to take a look at this commercial because I think it's pretty telling for today's conversation. Yeah, I mean, that's good enough to make you want to buy ugly shoes. So here's a guy who's missed 9,000 shots, over 9,000 shots in his career. He lost almost 300 games. He was given the opportunity to take the game-winning shot in his NBA career at that last moment, and he missed that shot 26 times. Just out of curiosity, I went and looked up how many times he made the game-winning shot. 25. This is a guy that is considered Mr. Clutch. If you're at the end of the game and you want to win, he's the guy you want to have the ball. He missed the game-winning shot more than he made the game-winning shot. And yet, he's a guy who claims that fact as one of the reasons for his success. Because he failed over and over and over again. He learned from that failure. He moved beyond it, and he got better through it. And that's pretty inspiring. And sometimes when we fail, we are able to do that. And when I'm at my best, and I get a little separation from the failure or the mistake that I made, I'm able to look back on it, and I'm able to learn a little something from it. Now, having said that, that is not always an easy task. Sometimes the mistakes that we make, the failures that we encounter in our life can be pretty devastating. And actually, some of them can be quite costly. And they can cost us and the people we know and care about a great deal. They can affect the organizations that we're dedicated to in big, big ways. Sometimes the mistakes we make are really, really costly. And there may be some lessons to learn, but there's going to be some time before we can get to that place, because right now we're paying the price for a mistake that we made. One of the reasons that we experience the fear of failure is because we are wired. We've talked about this through the series. Our brain is wired. When we come up to a moment where there is potential risk, that amygdala starts firing, and it starts telling us to be cautious. And if we've made mistakes before in the past where we've learned that what we've done has cost us and put us or others or organizations at risk, when our brain experiences that we're in that same place, its job is to hit the brakes and slow us down, because it wants to keep us safe. It wants to keep us from doing that. It is working in the background all the time. So when we experience the fear of failure, that is a perfectly natural, normal response to something that may be going on in our life. But again, the question is, how do we know if the fear of failure that we're experiencing is something that we've got to pay attention to because it really could hurt us, or the people that we love, or the organizations that we're dedicated to? Or how do we recognize that, okay, I'm overplaying this one, and I've got to move through it? Because if we can't sort that out, then we're going to find ourselves constantly struggling with the fear of failure, and we might burst through it in ways that we shouldn't, and we might hold back because of it in ways that we shouldn't. And I think one of the places where we can start when it comes to how we sort this out is to figure out what is the source of our fear. What's behind our fear, right? So fear is kind of something that presents itself, but there's usually a cause that's going on, and sometimes we need to unpack that and figure out what it is. Why are we afraid of this, and what is it that we're afraid of? For example, there are certain risks that I take in my life that do not cause me any pause, and they do not cause me any fear. I do not worry about them. 7 years ago, I traveled halfway across the planet to compete in a Swedish reality TV show, and I had zero concerns or fears about that. I was not worried about that at all, and I really didn't have much hesitation in doing it. For me, the fear was if I didn't do it, then I was guaranteed to fail. If I didn't take the shot, I'm going to miss. So I'm going to take the shot, and I'm going to go do it, and I'm going to experience it, and I wasn't really concerned or afraid of that. But some of the people that I know and some of the people that I love and people who know and love me, they had some fears and they had some worries. Are you sure? Do you know what you're doing? Do you know what you're getting into? And say, I don't know, what's the worst thing that can happen? Right? I just really didn't have too much concern about it. And for me, there's a lot of things in my life where I feel that way. Why not try? Because really the risks are pretty minimal. I may lose, or I may get embarrassed, or it may be a little bit awkward, but I'm one who really doesn't care if I'm embarrassed or not. I've lost a lot, so I don't mind that either. I'd rather win, but you know, what does it mean to lose? Those kinds of things, I don't feel like I'm giving up all that much. So that doesn't bother me. I'm not afraid of that. I'll tell you where fear backs me up and where my brain hits the brakes. If I'm about to make a decision where if I make a mistake and if I fail, I let someone down. If I disappoint someone or let someone down, for me, that is the biggest fear of failure that I carry. I can't stand the thought of letting down my family because I made a mistake or I failed at something. I worry about failing the church that I love and serve. I worry about making a mistake and doing something wrong that damages this organization. I don't want to do that. I don't want to disappoint anyone or let anyone down. I got 4 hours of sleep last night. Why? Because I kept do I cancel, do we worship? Do I cancel, do we worship? Do I cancel, do we worship? And I am back and forth over and over and over again, realizing that no matter what decision I make, I'm going to make someone happy and I'm going to disappoint someone else. Someone's going to agree with me, someone's going to think something else. Someone's going to think I'm too cautious, or someone's going to think I'm too reckless. No matter what decision I made this morning, someone was going to feel a certain way about it. And maybe you feel a certain way about it. But I was worried because I didn't want to disappoint you. I didn't want to let you down. I don't want to disappoint or let down my friends if I make a mistake with them. And if I fail, I don't want to disappoint or let God down. I really worry about disappointing people and letting them down. And if there is a chance that that's going to happen through a mistake or a failure of mine, man, it makes me back up. And sometimes those fears are not entirely rational. Sometimes they are, but sometimes they aren't. And if I've done something where I've made a mistake and I've failed, and I think the result is that I've disappointed or let someone down, man, I just feel it in the pit of my stomach. I hate it. I don't like the way it feels. Maybe you've experienced something like that before. Maybe your fears of failure and your worries about failure are different. Maybe you feel like if you fail, you lose. And losing is hard for some folks. And sometimes it feels like if we don't win, we lose. Maybe you're worried that you're going to be embarrassed, that you're going to look foolish, you're going to look unprepared, or something's going to come across in a way that isn't the way you want it to come across, and you're going to feel shame. Maybe you're worried that if you fail, you're going to be rejected by someone. You know, it can be really, really hard for those of us who are people pleasers to feel like if we make a mistake, people are going to reject us and turn away from us. And what does that mean? And we don't like the way that feels. There are all kinds of reasons that we struggle with the fear of failure. And while my reasons might be different from yours, when we get on that precipice and we're standing there, sometimes the fear of failure just stops us in our tracks. We don't know what to do. And sometimes the fear of failure backs us up almost like it's we're against a rock in a hard place. I'll give you an example as a parent. I love my boys. I want nothing more than my boys to love me. But because of that, sometimes I've struggled disciplining them. Because I'm worried that if I discipline them, I might be building a wedge between me and them. I might be disappointing them. I might be hurting their feelings. I might be making them feel like they failed or let me down. There's all kinds of things that come into play with that. And there's been some times where I knew that disciplinary action was correct, and I knew that as their father, I had to do that. In order to be a good father, discipline has to take place at points in a child's life. And at the same time, I knew if I disciplined them in this particular way, there's going to be some hard feelings. So if I don't do it, I fail. If I do it, I feel like you see what I'm talking about? I mean, sometimes it feels just like you're caught in between. And that's when we've got to figure out, is it real? Is it rational? Or is it irrational? Is it not real? How do we do that? Well, here's some tools that I've used to kind of help me do that, and maybe they'll help you. Maybe you've got some tools of your own. The first thing for me is something that we've already talked about a little bit, and that's naming the fear of failure. I'm a big advocate in believing that when it comes to overcoming our fears, the first thing we have to do is name what the fear is. First of all, it is okay to be afraid. I don't care how big and tough you are physically or emotionally, it is okay to be afraid. And sometimes when we're afraid, the most important thing we can do is to name what it is that we fear. I fear failing right now, because if I fail, I may let someone down or disappoint them, right? Then I've named it and I know what's going on. So then I can ask myself, okay, is this fear of failure and this fear of disappointing or letting someone down, is that rational or irrational? And sometimes the fear is rational. Sometimes there are reasons that our brain puts on the brakes, and sometimes we are facing something that if we fail, the costs of failure are so high that we may need to pump the brakes or take another path entirely, right? We don't have to overcome our failures, our fear of failure every single time, because sometimes we need to stop and pull back because our fears are telling us something important. We need to listen to that. And if we discover that it's rational, we need to pull back. But sometimes it's irrational. Just another example, I'm kind of a perfectionist, and there have been multiple times in my life where I've been afraid of failure because I wasn't going to get whatever I was doing perfect. right? And so I just didn't even start because if it wasn't perfect, it wasn't worth doing. And then I have to remind myself, oh, wait, no one's perfect, right? So if I get locked in the fear of failure because it isn't perfect, I'm not going to get anything done. That's an irrational fear. And if that's an irrational fear, then I've got to push through that and go ahead and do it, even if it isn't going to be perfect. Another step that's been really helpful for me is just reaching out and talking to someone. And I know that that can be vulnerable. Sitting down and talking to your spouse or significant other, your partner, talking to a friend, talking to a mentor, a pastor, a colleague, and sitting down and saying, look, I'm really afraid of this. I'm afraid I'm going to fail. This is what I'm worried about. Can you walk me through it a little bit? And then you're reminded that you're not alone. The second thing, the last thing that I'll mention to you that kind of ties back to something we've already mentioned is just, man, offer yourself a little bit of grace. The core teaching of Christianity is this idea of grace and forgiveness. And what I've discovered when it comes to grace and forgiveness is that it's often more difficult for me to give myself grace and forgiveness than it is to give someone else grace and forgiveness. You're going to fail. You're going to make a mistake. At some point, you're going to get it wrong. Okay. So does everyone else. And so give yourself just a little bit of grace. And just as a quick side note there, because we all fail, it means that you know someone who fails. You know someone who makes mistakes. You know someone who gets it wrong. I'd like to invite you in that moment, if you experience that with someone, to remember the golden rule and to treat them as you would want to be treated yourself, right? To recognize that, yeah, I've failed before too, and I know what that's like. So I'm here for you in the midst of anything that you might be experiencing as you walk through failure. Those are some things, some steps that you might take to help you confront, kind of sort through your fears of failure so you can live less afraid with more hope and courage. So after Moses had been talking with God at the burning bush, Moses, as we know, decided to go ahead and answer God's call. So Moses goes to Egypt, and in spite of all of his fears of failure, he's actually pretty successful. He leads the people of Israel out of their bondage of slavery in Egypt, guides them through the wilderness, and within 2 years of leaving, the people of Israel find themselves at the promised land. And they're about to enter into the promised land. And God says, before you go into the promised land, you need to send 12 spies into the land so that they can see what's going on and come back and report to you. And I want them to spend 40 days in the land of Israel. So they name 12 spies, and the 12 spies go into the land of Israel, into the promised land. They're there for 40 days. They come back after they've looked around, and everybody says, how was it? It's, oh gosh, it's better than we could have ever imagined. It is amazing. It is flowing with milk and honey. It's wonderful. I can't imagine a better place on earth. It is absolutely perfect and fantastic. And everybody said, yes, let's go. And a bunch of the spies said, well, wait a minute. There's some people who currently live there, and they're really big, and they're really strong, and they're really fierce. In fact, when we stand next to them, we're like little grasshoppers. And if we try to go take this land from them, we're going to fail. And they're going to kill us. And it's all going to be for naught. And now there was a couple other spies that were with them, and they said, no, it's going to be okay. We're not going to fail. God has told us that if we go and if we trust in God and if we have courage, God's going to lead us through that, and it's going to turn out okay. We're going to be fine. Let's go. Now's the time. But the people rebelled. And they started whispering, I'd rather die in slavery in Egypt than go get killed by some monster in some promised land I've never even seen or known. I'm not going to do it. And so out of fear of failure, the nation of Israel decides when they are standing on the boundary of the promised land, they're not going to go in. And so God says, okay, you don't want to go in because you're afraid you're going to fail. Even though I've given you some promises and assurances, here's the deal I'm going to make with you. For every day that the spies were in the promised land, that's a year you don't get to come back. You've spent about 2 not in the promised land since you escaped slavery. Now you're going to spend another 38 years because your fear of failure and your lack of trust in me kept you out of realizing your goal when you were so close. So for 38 years, the people of Israel didn't get to enter in the promised land because they had a fear of failure. Everything was right there in sight, and they walked away. Couldn't trust. So 38 years later, almost everybody, there's only a couple people who are still alive from the original crew. Moses, he didn't live this long. He doesn't get to go in the promised land. So this guy named Joshua, who's leading the people of Israel, and Joshua says, hey, God says it's time for us to go back into the promised land now. Are you all ready to go? And they said, wait a minute. Are the big giants still there? Because if they're still there, I'm not sure I wanted to go do this. This is scary. I'm afraid we're going to fail. And the fears were expressed, and they got back to God. And this is what God told Joshua. Be strong and courageous. Do not be frightened or dismayed, for the Lord your God is with you wherever you go. When you read this passage, do you see in it a promise of success? I don't. Because there is no promise of success in this. And for me, that's the most powerful part of the words that God gave to Joshua in this time of fear and worry and this being afraid to fail and go and do it, is God says to Joshua, you can have courage. And you don't have to be frightened, and you don't have to be dismayed. You don't have to give in to that, because I am with you wherever you go. Which means if you succeed, I'm with you. But if you fail, I'm with you. What a powerful message for us. Because sometimes we're going to overcome our fear of failure, and we're going to succeed. And God's going to be with us, and God's going to share the joy of our success. But sometimes we're going to push past our fear of failure, and we're going to try anyway, and we're going to fail. And we're going to fall short. And it might feel really terrible, and we might feel really bad about it, but guess what? God is with us. And we're not alone. And so if you're standing on the precipice of a decision where the fear of failure might be working on you, have courage. Don't be afraid. Try to live boldly with hope, knowing that whether you succeed or whether you fail, you're not alone. For God is with you. And I don't know about you, but I find that to be incredibly good news. Amen.